No one saw it coming. Not like this, not with such quiet finality. For years, the situation had unfolded in a way that felt almost predictable, a cycle of provocation followed by silence, of public statements met with private restraint. But something shifted, and this time the response was different. There was no grand announcement, no carefully staged moment, just a firm decision made behind closed doors that carried more weight than any public declaration ever could. The absence of a Sandringham invitation may seem, at first glance, like a minor detail in the broader sweep of royal life, but in truth it represents something far more significant. It is the clearest indication yet that patience, once stretched to its limits, has finally given way to resolve. For a long while, the approach had been one of endurance. Difficult moments were absorbed, uncomfortable headlines endured, and the expectation remained that time might soften tensions. Yet time, in this case, did not heal. Instead, it appeared to embolden, creating a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Each new development added another layer, another complication, another reason for concern. Interviews brought private matters into the public sphere in ways that had not been seen before. Media projects, presented as personal ventures, leaned heavily on royal connections while simultaneously distancing themselves from the responsibilities those connections implied. Public appearances, carefully timed, seemed to intersect awkwardly with official duties, creating an undercurrent of tension that could not be easily dismissed. The Australian tour proved to be a turning point, though not in isolation. It was, rather, the moment when everything that had come before was brought into sharper focus. There was a sense that lines, once clearly understood, were becoming blurred. The distinction between public duty and private enterprise appeared less defined, and that ambiguity carried consequences. For an institution built on clarity of role and purpose, such uncertainty is not easily tolerated. What may have been overlooked in earlier instances began to feel more serious when viewed as part of pattern. It was no longer a question of isolated missteps, but of a broader approach that challenged established expectations. The king, known for his measured temperament and preference for quiet diplomacy, had long chosen to avoid escalation. His instinct has always been to preserve, to maintain continuity, to ensure that personal disagreements do not disrupt the wider stability of the monarchy. Yet even the most patient approach has its limits. There comes a point where inaction risks being interpreted as acceptance, where silence begins to undermine the very principles it seeks to protect. That point, it seems, has now been reached. Complicating matters further was the manner in which the idea of a Sandringham visit was introduced into the conversation. It was not presented as a simple, heartfelt request, but rather as a possibility framed in such a way that it placed responsibility on the king to respond. The language used suggested openness, yet it carried conditions, subtle but unmistakable. The presence or absence of certain family members was mentioned, turning what might have been a private gathering into something that felt conditional, almost transactional. For observers, this raised uncomfortable questions. Family relationships, particularly those involving young children, are deeply personal, and the suggestion that access to those relationships might depend on specific terms struck many as troubling. The king's position, in this regard, is especially poignant. Opportunities to spend time with his grandchildren have been limited, and that distance is not merely a matter of circumstance but one of genuine emotional weight. It is widely understood that he values those connections deeply, and the absence of regular contact is something that cannot easily be dismissed. Against that backdrop, the framing of the Sandringham visit took on a different tone. What might have been seen as an olive branch instead appeared, to some, as a form of pressure, an attempt to shape the situation by appealing to a known point of vulnerability. Whether intentional or not, the effect was significant. There were also practical considerations that could not be overlooked. A visit to Sandringham is not simply a family occasion. It carries with it a range of implications that extend beyond the personal. Security arrangements, funding responsibilities, and public perception all come into play. In this instance, those factors were particularly sensitive. The question of who bears the cost of protection has been a recurring issue, one that has both financial and symbolic dimensions. Any formal invitation, especially one extended by the king, would inevitably involve state-funded security, a detail that cannot be separated from the broader context. At a time when independence has been so strongly emphasized, the acceptance of such provisions could be seen as contradictory. For the monarchy, which operates under constant public scrutiny, such contradictions are not easily ignored. Every action is examined, every decision weighed, and the potential for misunderstanding is ever present. Extending an invitation under these circumstances would have required careful consideration, not only of personal feelings but of the message it would send. Would it be seen as reconciliation or as concession? Would it reinforce existing concerns or help to resolve them? These are not simple questions, and the answers carry real consequences. In choosing not to issue the invitation, the king has made a statement that is both subtle and profound. It is not a rejection in the conventional sense, nor is it an attempt to escalate tensions. Rather, it is a refusal to engage under terms that do not align with established principles. It signals that certain boundaries remain in place, regardless of personal relationships. This is not an easy position to take, particularly when it involves family. The cost is evident in the continued distance from his grandchildren, a reality that cannot be softened by institutional reasoning. Yet leadership, especially in a role such as this, often requires decisions that are difficult on a personal level but necessary in a broader context. The monarchy's strength lies in its consistency, its ability to uphold standards even when doing so is uncomfortable. If the silence surrounding that decision felt deliberate, what followed made its meaning impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a private family matter unfolding behind closed doors. It had grown into something far more layered, shaped by pressure from public expectation, shifting perception, and the steady weight of reality catching up. For a long time, there had been a carefully maintained image, one that suggested independence, control, and a fresh direction. But over time, that image began to crack under closer scrutiny. Questions started to surface, not out of hostility, but out of curiosity that slowly turned into doubt. Maintaining a high-profile life away from the traditional structure was never going to be simple, and the costs, both visible and hidden, began to tell their own story. Security alone is not a minor concern. It is an ongoing, substantial expense that does not disappear with distance. Add to that the responsibilities of maintaining properties, managing teams, and handling legal matters, and the financial strain becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. It is within this context that the importance of a royal invitation truly becomes clear. Such an invitation is not merely symbolic or sentimental. It carries practical implications that can significantly ease those burdens. The provision of state-supported security alone represents a considerable shift, one that changes the financial landscape almost overnight. And yet, this is precisely where the complication lies. Accepting those benefits while maintaining a narrative of separation creates a contradiction that is hard to reconcile. It raises questions not just within the institution, but among those watching from the outside. The decision not to extend that invitation, therefore, does more than close a door for the summer. It quietly removes a possibility of that contradiction taking shape. It sends a message, not loudly, but clearly enough for those paying attention. Certain privileges cannot exist without the responsibilities that come with them. Timing, too, has played its part in shaping how all of this is perceived. Moments that might otherwise have passed without much notice have taken on greater significance when placed alongside official duties carried out under considerable strain. When one side is visibly committed to fulfilling obligations, often at personal cost, while the other appears focused on maintaining visibility in a different way, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore. It is not always about intention. Sometimes it is simply about how things appear when viewed together. And in this case, those appearances have contributed to a growing sense that the balance is no longer quite right. At the same time, the media landscape has shifted in ways that make it harder than ever to control the narrative. Information now flows from multiple directions, and not all of it aligns neatly. Financial realities, once discussed in vague terms, are now examined with greater detail. Reports of rising costs, uncertain returns, and projects that have yet to meet expectations have added depth to the conversation. This has changed how people engage with the story. There is less willingness to accept things at face value, and more interest in what lies beneath the surface. That shift has made moments like this one, quiet decisions made without fanfare, stand out even more. They feel deliberate, calculated, and impossible to dismiss as coincidence. What makes this situation particularly striking is the restraint with which it has been handled. There has been no public confrontation, no dramatic escalation, no attempt to turn it into a spectacle. Instead, the response has been measured, almost understated, yet undeniably firm. It reflects a choice to maintain control without adding fuel to an already complex situation. And perhaps that is what makes it so effective. It does not demand attention, but it commands it nonetheless. The absence of an invitation speaks in a way that words often cannot, leaving space for interpretation while still making the core message unmistakably clear. Looking ahead, the real question is not what has happened, but what happens next. Decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They set a tone, create expectations, and influence what follows. Will this mark the beginning of a more consistent approach, where boundaries are drawn and maintained? Or is it a singular moment, shaped by specific circumstances that may not repeat themselves? For now, there are no clear answers, only signs, signals, and a growing sense of the dynamic has shifted in a way that cannot easily be reversed. And perhaps that is where the real intrigue lies. Because while this chapter may seem to close quietly, it leaves behind a trail of unanswered questions. What comes next will not be decided in public statements or carefully chosen words, but in actions, subtle, deliberate, and impossible to ignore once they unfold. Something has changed, and whether this is the beginning of a larger transformation or just a calm before something far more significant, that is a story still waiting to be told.